Thank you, Luke. I think our minister is just gracefully exiting, and thank you, Kent. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to be here and presenting to you this morning on what is, I think, one of the most important sessions over this day, over the conference, looking at English language, ELICOS, Cricos, and the National Code driving quality. Before I start, as with colleagues before me, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Throughout this conference, the theme of international education has been woven into so many presentations, and indeed the relevance of English language has been prominent from the very first session in terms of the state of the sector that Anthony delivered. I was encouraged when Anthony again acknowledged that there isn't any evidence of any systemic issue within English language, and in fact the performance of international students continues to improve. And so we need to actually look at that narrative. I hope that sessions like today start to improve the dialogue around the quality of our English language sector. Luke outlined the colleagues that are going to be presenting, so I won't do that. But as international students play a vital role in our education system, fostering vibrant campus communities for social and cultural development, whilst also offering that diversified income stream, we can't lose sight of quality. With student loads on average of 22%, both many of our leading universities much higher, we need to again look at what systems are in place to protect that quality. International student continues to reach record numbers, and the Minister gave some wonderful figures again, but even year to date, it's 9% over on September figures from same time last year. Being driven through higher education at 10% growth, with VET exceeding that at 17.5% growth, and the English language sector, for which I represent, actually having a rebound in September to just over 3% growth. However, there are some warning signs, and certainly our major international market, that being from China, has shown a slowdown and indeed declining 1.3% year to date. In some of our sectors, in ELICOS, it's actually 14% down, and in our school sector, 20% down. So we cannot be complacent with where we sit in the global landscape, and that excellence and quality needs to be paramount. I think in terms of our global reputation, the one thing that we do have is that reputation for quality, and it's the one driving force that each one of our competitor nations will equally try to obtain. As the head of a national peak body, I know firsthand the value of strong partnerships, and I commend TEQSA for setting the theme of this conference around the topic of partnerships in driving quality. The collaborative approach that they've shown through the development of many of their resources, and Anthony again outlined a number of those through the guidance notes, I think does show a real collaborative approach. And on a first-hand basis, I saw that with the development of the guidance note on direct entry ELICOS. And again, a really important tool to enable providers to look at how you're calibrating assessment, but protect that English for academic purpose pathway for which many of our students enter into Australian higher education. As with any partnership, I think you always know there's going to be good and bad. I'm pleased to say, certainly in my interactions, there's been much more good than bad in dealing with TEQSA. But it's also fair to say that there's been an evolution since the development of TEQSA, and indeed the focus on international student and international student compliance. I've been encouraged with the evolution that there's been the development of the dedicated team, the Cricos and our ESOS team. And so today we have the opportunity to hear firsthand from a number of those colleagues from TEQSA around their experience. And as with the theme which was outlined at the start of the conference and feedback from previous conferences, it's an opportunity for you to hear and engage with these colleagues. So we'll be aiming to leave question time at the end, and please once again use the app to capture that question time. So I'm going to start for the session with the first question over to my colleague Cris. And Cris, I guess in that topic of sharing information, can I ask you how the Cricos team has been, ESOS team has been formed, and could you just please outline some of the achievements you've seen or perceived to date? Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Good morning, everybody. As Brett mentioned, my name is Cris Vega, and I'm the Assistant Director for the ESOS Cricos team. Today, I will be just giving you a brief overview about the team. So the ESOS Cricos team was established in April 2018. It is one of the 4 teams that comprise TEQSA's Assessment and Investigations group. Also, in terms of, I guess, the purpose of the team, so we were established to ensure that assessment of all Cricos applications are assessed under the ESOS Act, including the ELICOS and the foundation standards. Now, prior to the establishment of the team in April last year, all assessments of Cricos applications were conducted by the TEQSA case teams, who also are responsible for assessing applications under the TEQSA Act and also the higher education standards. So you can imagine the volume of work that our colleagues at the assurance group have undertaken prior to the team being created. Now, as Brett mentioned, the ESOS Cricos team, we have 6 full-time staff, including an assistant director, 3 senior assessment managers, an assessment manager, and an assessment support officer. Bit of a handful, but that's us in a nutshell. In addition to, I guess, the assessment work that we undertake, we also are responsible for the management or provide liaison with standalone ELICOS providers who have direct entry partnerships or arrangements to higher education providers. Now, there's approximately 17 standalone ELICOS providers that TEQSA regulate. We also engage and work collaboratively with our TEQSA colleagues, primarily from the assurance group, to ensure that our engagement and with our higher education providers are consistent and also cohesive and effective. Now, we also, as Brett mentioned, we've engaged and we work very strongly with peak bodies and other colleagues within the sector, other departments and also agencies like the Department of Home Affairs, Education, ASQA, and other state and territory regulatory bodies. Now, in terms of, the work that we do, since we've been established, the team has completed or have assessed over 1,000 applications. A lot of them in the 2018-2019 financial year were related to Cricos re-registration, initial registration. We also had cancelled Cricos registration of providers at the provider's request, and also undertook over 600 assessments that in TEQSA we refer to as TEQSA Other. Now, in provider, speak, that would involve adding or withdrawing courses to Cricos, increasing capacity, adding new locations, adding ELICOS and foundation studies program. Now, as a result, of our assessments in the past 18 months, we've established or we've identified sector trends and practices, both good and bad, that will assist us in providing better education and guidance to the sector in order for them to, in order for providers to comply with their legislative requirements. But we also wish to utilise that information and the data that we have to work in collaboration and in partnership with providers, so that you know exactly what is it that you need to do under the standards, and for us to be able to give you clearer guidance. Now, in terms of undertaking our assessments, as you would know, you provide evidence and materials to us, so we do review that, and in addition, we review your websites, social media presence. We also refer to our TEQSA provider risk assessments, and also refer to our colleagues within the assurance group for, a more holistic overview about the provider, the history, or any, issues or that may have been identified throughout the course of the year. Now, as I said, not only have we identified, I guess, practices or trends within the sector that will obviously help in guiding and assisting providers, but internally as well, we've, in undertaking our assessments, we've found that some of our work practices may not necessarily be the best that they could be. So we've determined that we need more further enhancements and development. Now, the team's very cognizant of the fact that this internal processes and internal review and improvements that we will be undertaking, or we're currently undertaking, will not only benefit us as a team in terms of improving our efficiencies and workload, but that will also translate to the providers and to the sector in the form of, better evidence requirements or more robust Cricos applications, and also being able to provide guidance notes to the sector. Now, my colleagues later on, Alex and Kim, will be able to provide and elaborate a little bit more about the team learnings and also, the current projects that we're undertaking.
Thank you, Cris. Over to you, Alex, and I guess Cris just outlined a considerable volume of work that's been undertaken since the team's been established. And what's important, I think, for the sector to hear is, are you identifying any areas of good practice? Is there ways in which that could be shared? And indeed, I'd like to hear some of that this morning. So I guess from your experience, given the volume of work, are there any particular areas of good practice that could be highlighted to the audience?
So like Cris mentioned, we've completed over 1,000 Cricos application assessment in the last financial years, and the assessment that we've completed have identified that our providers are generally aware and compliant with the ESOS legislative frameworks, and all of the policies and procedures that we have assessed so far have all been updated to reflect the changes to the National Code and the ELICOS standards. And most, if not all of our providers are managing the overall student capacity in PRISM very well, and they engage with us early prior to reaching the capacity limits. We've also found that the providers are generally keen to engage, seek advice and guidance regarding the National Code and the reporting requirements. And when the provider is found and notified of areas of non-compliances or at risk of non-compliances, they are willing to work with us and provide further information and context, and also modify their practices if required. There are actually many examples of good practice in the sectors, and I'm sure we'll see more of it in the future assessment. But one of them that we've identified recently is it's a provider who had a really robust procedure in place to regularly inspect PRISM agent lists to, let's say, ensure that the education agent details are up to date and match the agent detail published on their website. Another example of good practice is a provider that has embedded the National Code training within the staff induction program and to conduct the regular refresher training, and including the PRISM reporting to ensure that the staff are aware of changes to the code and are aware of the provider's obligations under the National Code. It is also great for us to see that some providers are able to ensure that their policies and procedures are written in plain English, easy to follow, clear, while still delivering sometimes very complex information as required by the National Code. And that they publish, they make their policies and procedures publicly available on their website and easily accessible by any intending students. With the good practices, we've also identified some issues, especially the assessment of Cricos renewal registrations have highlighted some gaps in practices, which impacts the provider's ability to comply with the National Code and ESOS Act. For example, some providers don't outline their complaints and appeals information in the opposition written agreement, which leads to non-compliance with the Standard 3 of the National Code. Some providers don't outline corrective actions that may be undertaken by the provider in the event that the education agent breaches the agent code of ethics or the contracts in the education agent contracts. While we've noted that nearly all of the agents manage their overall student capacity very well, sometimes they overlook the capacity at each individual location, and it is important to remember that it is provider responsibility to not only manage the overall capacity but also operate within the limit of capacity given at each delivery locations. And I guess last but not least is we see a lot time in time that providers don't have, or there is ineffective procedure in place to ensure that the student enrollment variations are undertaken in PRISM in accordance with the PRISM reporting guidelines and within the legislative framework. And as Cris has mentioned earlier, PRISM has become one of the very important regulatory tools for TEQSA to test the provider's application of their policies and national code. And based on the review of the PRISM data, we found that not all of the providers are effectively utilising the PRISM data to quality assure that their practices match the policies. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, we can see that there's misalignment between these two.
Thank you. Some really important points there, and it's interesting as the data transparency around, particularly around agent performance, it's improving, and the work of the Department of Education to share more of that analytical information with institutions. I think it's really pertinent that you've already pointed out that having access to the data is valuable for our institutions, but the scrutiny that will now come around the use of that data will also be high on the radar of our regulator. One very useful tip. In that regard, though, I guess in another point you've sort of outlined not just some areas of good practice, but you also noted a few areas of issues. And I think equal to the demonstration of good practice is knowing where the issues lie to allow people to try and rectify those. Over to Kim, and I guess, Kim, what have you seen in terms of what are any ideas? So do you have any idea of the known issues, and how is the team addressing them to ensure future compliance and indeed help educate the sector around regulatory processes?
So at the moment, TEQSA and especially the ESOS Cricos team have a number of projects that we're utilising moving forward in order to help educate the sector and provide, I guess, a framework for future compliance. The first project that I'd like to talk about, it's called the Lean Project. Basically, it's about TEQSA adopting a lean approach to continuous work improvement. What it means for us as a team, and also some outcomes for the sector, is that we've created some new and refined our internal work practices. What we're hoping that will achieve is a consistent and transparent decision-making process, so that providers are getting consistency with the decisions across the sector. We've also created some new confirmed evidence tables, and we're hoping that they'll clearly establish what documents providers need to submit to TEQSA in order to submit decision-ready applications in the first instance. And we're hoping that what that'll achieve for the sector is will improve TEQSA's timeliness in processing applications, reducing burdens and requests for information so that we don't have them ongoing and creating delays. Along with this, we're also updating our application forms so that they have the correct legislative references on them and they do align with the confirmed evidence tables. And we're hoping to update them on the website ASAP. We've even got feedback at the conference, at this conference, just letting us know that the application forms, sometimes they're not conducive to providers being able to demonstrate their compliance with a national code, because the documents that they are required to submit aren't reflective of that in the current application forms. Lastly, we're updating our website to include some more Cricos and ESOS related information, just to reduce the amount of queries, and so it's all there as a one-stop shop for providers to have that relevant information. Further to this, we've been attempting to actively engage with providers earlier in the assessment process for applications, so that we can identify and highlight any issues that we're finding before we make a decision or send out an official request, to give providers a chance to address that. We have received feedback from the sector that providers are really appreciative that they're getting the chance to correct or highlight to us how they actually are demonstrating their compliance with our concerns prior to receiving that official notice. And it's helping us work in partnership instead of utilising, I guess, regulatory interventions like conditions before it gets to that stage. The last thing that we're working on in the ESOS team is the ELICOS reaccreditation project. It's simply come about because we haven't assessed ELICOS projects to assure them in the last 5 years. So we thought it was a good time to assess them against the new ELICOS standards, 2018. We're developing the scope and priorities of the project, keeping in mind that we do want to minimise regulatory burden for providers. And with this in mind, the priority of the ELICOS project will be providers that are not members of NEAS or English Australia. They haven't been subject to a NEAS review in the last 2 years, and standalone ELICOS providers. The current stage that we're at is that we're finalising the appointment of a project manager to undertake the project. We're thinking the project will take between 6 and 9 months, and we're happy to report that there's no cost to providers to participate in the project. And moving forward, we're contacting all the affected providers with the confirmed evidence requirements for the project to start gathering the documentation. And I guess the outcomes to the project are that we want to update the TEQSA website with guidance notes to better inform the sector, and generally identify trends to be able to help the sector work together to assure the quality of the ELICOS courses.
Thank you, Kim. Before we move on to Ahmed, I just generally in terms of the horizon and across the ESOS Cricos space, are there any regulatory changes or any new areas of focus? I mean, Kim, you've just outlined the reaccreditation process around the English or ELICOS standards, but is there anything else in that space that the sector should be aware of that TEQSA may be focusing on moving forward?
I guess the primary change that has taken into effect at this point in time is the ESOS Regulations 2019, which came into effect in October, the 1st of October this year. So generally, in essence, for you who have read or know of the regulations, the new regulations, it's pretty much in essence similar to its predecessor. Now, providers are already undertaking reporting via PRISMs. It's just that the changes are more to do with the details that's required to be entered by providers in PRISMs. Now, primarily that involves English tests, education agent data, also student data, particularly in terms of when a breach to a student visa condition is made, and also the evidence, the new regulations also provides an expanded definition of what tuition fees are, which, I guess within the sector, there's a little bit of a lack of clarity of what the definition, what is a tuition fee, what is a non-tuition fee. So the revised or the new regulations provides more definitive definitions and provides examples as to what items are classified as tuition fees or non-tuition fees. I think in terms of just entering English language test information, as I've said before, it's no additional burden because you're already doing it. It's just that in terms of students who require an English test to apply for a student visa, the day in which the student undertook the test will also need to be entered on Prisms. So you're already putting in the data about, you know, what test type the student took and the results that they've had. It's just another field to put down the date that the student took that test. Now, for the students who I guess have already got a student visa or had submitted their application for a visa, and at the point of application the student was classified as not requiring an English test, the providers are now required to identify the class that the student was classified in order to be exempt from the English test requirements. Now, I'm not going to go any further into that detail because it's more leaning towards the migration regulations and the Migration Act, which I'm not an expert on, but I would definitely encourage providers to familiarise yourselves with the new regulations and also the requirements, particularly in terms of the English language test information that you need to enter. In terms of agent information, again, you're already doing this. The only change is that it needs to be the data that you need to provide about an agent is for every student that has been enrolled and and that enrolment was facilitated by a provider's education agent. You also need to enter the agent's details, so the director's contact details, name, contact details, as I said, but also an agent's employee, who facilitated that student's enrolment for that course. So, you know, it's, as I said, it's pretty much similar to what were in the, you know, the data that you needed to enter from the previous regulation. It's just that there are additional details that you need to provide. Now, from a regulator's perspective, we obviously welcome the changes to the new regulations. We believe that this will assist us in undertaking our regulatory work, but it will also support and strengthen the integrity of the student visa framework and also the reputation of the Australian international education system. Now, in terms of, I mean, in addition to allowing us to undertake better regulatory, I guess, monitoring of providers' compliance to, I guess, the ESOS Act and the National Code, we also feel that the data will enhance providers' capacity to be able to quality assure their processes and their operations and make sure that they're complying with their legislative requirements. So I think in terms of, you know, as Alex alluded to before, we utilise PRISM's data when we undertake our assessments, and it's becoming more prevalent as, you know, the team has come into being. And in future, I think, you know, seeing that the regulations are now in effect, the expectation would be that providers are now entering the details, the additional information that they're required to under the new regulations, and that the I guess the changes are also reflected in your policies and your procedures and in the way that you operate within your institutions, and that the changes are also communicated and I guess assimilated throughout your institutions, not just for your staff or your students, but also to those I guess parties, third parties that you have or you've engaged to represent you.
Okay, thank you, Cris. As I noted at the start of the panel session today, we're very fortunate to have Ahmed with us to provide the student perspective. I've had the pleasure of working with Ahmed on a number of different committees, and you go a long way to find someone as articulate, informed, and just ultimately cool as Ahmed to be able to come and provide that perspective. And as the National President for the Council for International Students Australia and historically part of the executive for a number of years, he's been a wonderful adversary for the role of the student. Ahmed, the student experience must be at the heart of the work that we do in international education and education delivery. And no doubt students are significantly impacted if there is low quality provision or indeed at a more significant end, a provider closure. From your perspective, or could you please provide the students' perspective and that of CISA's around the regulatory environment?
Sure. Look, first of all, I'm grateful to be here and be part of the late night show with Brett Blacker. It's a very authentic environment, and Brett is known to be as the best MC that I've ever seen. In terms of the regulatory closures, we worked with TEQSA and ASCA and TPS in the past before. The closure of these schools puts a big trauma on students, not only economically, but also mentally as well. I received many calls and voicemails from different students with a broken heart and tearful voice that they try to contact us to find a solution. Either the course is no longer offered or there was a problem with the school. They were lucky to be contacting us, but there were a lot more students out there who didn't know what we were doing and they didn't know what to do as well. I guess in terms of the regulation versus agency, it's a great debatable topic, and how do we ensure the great balance between them? And the regulation, is it there to sort of guide the way, or is it there to constrict the way and be as rules? But what I know is that there are schools closing, and there's a great number last year, and we do need to do, I guess, the best as we can to ensure that there are good business practices in place. And the other question that I was asked around, why do students choose these schools and what's the motivation? I guess that it's a volatile market and the fees are changing. University fees are known to be increasing every year, and these schools are cheaper for students, or maybe there is a migration outcome and they prefer to go to this school. And when we look at the data, only 14% of international students stay in the country. So the greater opportunity is actually back home. And any Australian certificates or a degree will do good for them when they go back home, because the employer will not look at the degree or the ranking of that specific institution when they're overseas. They are known to have Australian certificate, and that's enough for them. And I guess, and how do we sort of ensure our sustainability in this volatile global market? And there are different areas that we could talk about. I think increasing fees is something that comes up alongside students, and they want to know what's the justification behind increased fees, and why is it just simply matched with the market price? And I guess the return of investment is important for international students, and especially ROI as well. But they want to get that $100,000 back in a way that they can. And sometimes when we talk to institutions, they say, oh, we are here for education, we're not here for employability. But when we look at the marketing, it says all about employability. So there's a bit of contradiction there. And I guess the post-study work rights is not really known by the sector really well for international students. They are still having issues in terms of getting job. So they do sometimes prefer to go back home and work there rather than staying here. And I guess we still need to work on our public awareness why international education is important. Yesterday during conference, I was called to make a media statement by my public relations officer because one student was attacked. The article went on SBS as well, and student was told to go back to India when they were attacked when they were delivering food. And I guess we can still see that the local community still don't understand the importance of international education, not only about the number and how much it impacts to the economy, but also cultural impact and virtues that international students bring. I guess there is a lot that we can do in terms of that. And it is true that if the student doesn't choose Australia, they might choose other countries, and we still need to recognize that Australia is just one part of the picture in this global era. And we need to be mindful of, I guess, retaining our reputation as in Australian international education sector. And some of these put risk, as it was mentioned in the past topics as well, that these things put risk in university reputation in Australia if they are seen as business rather than an education space. And I guess it's not all just gloomy, but we could talk about the good practices as well, because I believe the punishment doesn't teach behaviour, positive reinforcement does. And there were a lot of good practices that was mentioned throughout the conference. I guess it's now our responsibility as the delegates to disseminate some of that information to our communities and our institutions, and hope to get some innovation and sort of improve the sector that we are in. In terms of CISA, I believe that everybody needs to do as best as they can. We are now launching a global student voice platform. So I'm inviting US, Canada, European countries and Asian countries as well, and their international student leaders to come together under one platform, and we could talk about, you know, what's happening in your country, what are the good practices happening, you know, in different countries. And I guess sometimes when we judge or criticize things, we need to look at, you know, how does success look like for us in terms of our own industry or our own space. How would you be happy? I know we are always, people like to talk about bad things for a week, and they like to talk about good things for one day. I guess that we need to talk about the really good things for more and more, so that we can try to influence others. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. All of our panellists have done exceptionally well at keeping to their time, and they've allowed enough time for the questions component of today's panel session as well. We have a few questions that have come through from the app already. If there's anyone else that would like to pose a question, I encourage you to do so now, and I can see some hands coming up. We'll have a couple of roving mics come around. But due to the effort that was made, I think we'll go to the first question, which was posed through the app, and it is: what do Cricos assessments involve, and what sort of issues may lead to a Cricos deregistration of a course or an institution? Who would like to handle that? Ahmed?
Thank you. I don't think it's my space when we have the amazing speakers here from TEQSA.
So what does a Cricos assessment involve? So basically, as you may know, a provider will submit an application through the provider portal, but previous to that, depending on whether or not the provider is a self-accrediting provider or a non-self-accrediting provider, TEQSA will engage and advise that, you know, I guess, prompt that, you know, Cricos re-registration is upon you, and these are the things that will be required. So for self-accrediting providers, we pretty much remind them that an external audit is required, and any management action plan that, as a result of that audit, will need to be submitted with the application. For providers who are non-self-accrediting, then we do provide a confirmed evidence table that lists all the evidence requirements in relation to the standards of the National Code. And then I guess once we've received that application, we do our assessment. So we review, as I said previously, we review the materials that you submit. At this point in time, if we require further information, if it's not very clear, then we will engage with the provider and request for more information. But as Kim mentioned before, hopefully the work that we're currently undertaking within the team for process improvements, and as I said, that will then translate to providers in the sector, will reduce the need to request for further information. So once that assessment is complete, as I said, we review, the risk assessments, the most recent risk assessment of the provider that TEQSA produced. We engage with our assurance group colleagues, and then we'll review websites, just do a bit of a spot check, and then, as Alex mentioned, we will go and have a look at PRISM's data. So obviously policies and procedures, they can be quite robust and it appears all nice and glossy. However, PRISM's data tells us a different story. So ideally what you're saying in your policies and procedures should match what the data that we're generating or we're getting from prisons as well. So once all of that has been, I guess, collated, we produce a report for the delegate to consider, and depending on what, areas of non-compliances or risks of non-compliances that we find, as Kim said, we do engage with the providers and let them know these are our findings, these are areas that we believe could be better, could be improved, and the providers provided the opportunity to provide a response or to rectify the areas. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we've also found is that the areas of risk for non-compliances are quite administrative in nature, so people forgetting to upload or update their tuition fees on PRISMs. They've updated their marketing or their recruitment material for that academic year, but then forgot to change PRISMs. So those are the kinds of, minor non-compliances that we've picked up as we review and analyse PRISM's data. Now, in terms of issues that may lead to deregistration, I have to say that I have not yet experienced that, so I'm not, in terms of, I think it's just in terms of demonstrating compliance against the standards and the ESOS code. So if on PRISMs it doesn't show that you're reporting students appropriately, or that you're not reporting students at all, when your policies and procedures say, yeah, sure, we undertake intervention strategies, we put the student through all these workshops, and then at the end of the day their enrolment is not discontinued after 5, 6, 7, 8 semesters, when they're only supposed to be there for 2 or 3 semesters, then those are, I guess, warning bells in terms of, the provider's not necessarily implementing their policies and the processes. As I said, a lot of what we've found to date is quite administrative, but my director, who's going to be speaking after this session, may be able to provide you with better or more detailed, response in terms of how, what would constitute a provider being deregistered.
Thank you, Cris. And can I see that show of hands again? And is there the roving? Yeah, would you mind standing up? We'll get the roving, or I might. Thank you, sir. That's a great initiative. In the meantime, as we're getting the mic over there, are all these projects that you're implementing, are we going to see an improvement in processing times and the responsiveness from the agency?
So we've actually already seen an improvement in our processing times, and we've also been able to identify, using our new internal processes, where applications are getting held up, to address the applications, the core reason why, and then allocate our work appropriately and prioritise the work so that it gets done within a timely manner. Sometimes it's not always possible within workforce, capacity, but we definitely have started to see that improvement trickle through.
Thank you. I think we'll hand over to the question from the floor. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself.
Thanks. Helen Ganil from Monash University. It's excellent to see ESOS and Cricos given a platform at the conference. I think it's a really good initiative. As a big provider with 30,000 international students, it's a huge part of our business, and great to get into the minds of TEQSA. I guess I'd like some clarification. During the conference, we've heard several times about TEQSA's risk proportionate approach to regulation, and I'm curious to hear whether you believe that should be and is applied to ESOS activities, and how that fits with increasing demands for information that the form says is only for non-self-accrediting providers, but which universities who have all green risk ratings are now asked for routinely for every application.
In response to applying the risk proportionality and necessity question, definitely, as part of TEQSA, as the agency, that is how we approach our regulatory work. So definitely that also translates to the work of the Cricos team. Sorry, the second question I'm not quite, if you can repeat it, please.
Is it on? Yeah. It may be addressed when you said you're releasing revised forms, but increasingly there's a disconnect between what the form says you need to provide when you're a self-accrediting provider and the nitty-gritty detail that we're being asked for applications such as position descriptions and job titles for people at a site.
So I think in terms of, as Kim mentioned, the review that we're currently undertaking will address those inconsistencies and the disconnect between the application and what's required or what you're being asked of. So as part of the project that we've undertaken, we've sat down and we've gone through the evidence requirements and thought through about what type of evidence or information do we need that will enable us to assess against the standards and for the provider to demonstrate that they are complying with the requirements of the standards. So definitely as part of this project, as I said, we will be undertaking a refresh of our applications and evidence requirements. So hopefully in future, in the not so distant future, that disconnect will no longer happen.
Just 2 minutes to go. Is there any question? I'm conscious of the other side of the room. No? Oh, one down, straight down the middle. And as we're getting it there's been a little bit of a chatter just on here around ASQA and TEQSA. And just very briefly, one statement around, do ASQA and TEQSA work together?
Absolutely. We regulate the same act and the standards, so in terms of sharing information and making sure that our decisions are consistent, we definitely do work with ASQA and also the departments, as I said, Home Affairs and Education, to make sure that we are providing consistent advice and guidance to the sector. And I think, and that's especially pertinent to dual sector providers as well.
Great. I'll leave it as a comment, but there's a note to try and make that alignment around the agent data that's coming out of PRISMs. So I'm going to just leave that as a comment versus a question. And hand to the last question down the middle, please.
Hello, my name's Wing from UWA. One of the things that has been a constant frustration for me is getting timely responses from the Cricos ESOS team on matters where I want to check my interpretation, and these can be quite complex and not necessarily within the specifics of the standard, but the standards do apply. So to the extent that you're making changes and looking at your processes, to what extent are you going to have some level of better interaction with case managers, as well as perhaps a helpline where any concerns that or matters of interpretation that providers might have can log their questions, and they will be responded in a timely manner. Because in the past, it's taken weeks, if not months, to get a response, and in some cases, constant follow-up from myself, and that's held up activities within the university. So I think that's something that you really need to address.
Thank you. A great question, and something I would like to address. I'm going to look to some of my colleagues over here in the case managers area and whether this would be picked up as a part of the next topic. Yeah, let's hear straight from the horse's mouth on that one, from our case managers dialogue, and I do not want to limit the question. I think it would be better that we have those responsible for those areas to be able to respond directly to that question. And I'm also getting a flashing light telling me that our time's up here, so I don't think we'd be able to do justice in terms of the timely response. So I'm going to defer that very pertinent question for our next session, which is our dialogue with the case managers. Colleagues, thank you very much for your interaction and participation. Please join me in thanking all of the panellists for today's session.